As the title suggests, I'm going to be discussing these two views, Prioritarianism and Egalitarianism. I have here just a very kind of rough definition of each of these. So Prioritarianism says it's better to benefit people who are worse off. We're given a choice between benefiting either of two people, one of whom is worse off. We ought to prefer benefiting the worse off of the two, at least assuming that the benefits would be equal in size in the case. That's Prioritarianism. Egalitarianism, or more strictly speaking, pluralist egalitarianism, tells us to balance or weigh up two principles or values. So the first principle says that less inequality in well-being is better than more. The second says that greater total well-being is better. Right? So we've got to balance those two considerations on this view. In cases where we've got two options where the total well-being is the same, we should prefer whichever is more equal. We've got a case where the two are equally equal, we should prefer whichever has the greater total. In cases where the two principles are kind of pulling in different directions, we have some principle which will tell us how to weigh the two against each other. So these are the two views I'm going to discuss. They're widely thought of as being kind of rivals or competitors. So I guess Parfit's really the main person responsible for introducing the distinction between these views, at least amongst philosophers. Right? And his suggestion is that there are lots of, probably some cases, where people had thought that based on the sort of intuitive judgments we would make about those cases, it suggests that we were egalitarians. Right? But actually, if you think about the cases, it might be there's a sort of different kind of justification for the same judgment, which would be a kind of prioritarian one. So it's important to distinguish the two. Okay. So, what's the difference? So, initially you might think these two views are going to be very similar in what they recommend in various cases. So, for example, if there, think of the example I gave before, so one person who's worse off than another, we can benefit either one of them. Well, if we benefit the one who's worse off, that's also going to have the result of kind of reducing the gap between them. Right? And so the goal of reducing inequality would also speak in favor of benefiting the worse off. Right? So the two views would agree about that case. There are some cases in which inequality can be eliminated without benefiting anyone. And so those are cases of what's called leveling down. So leveling down occurs when you have a situation of inequality and you just level down the better off person or group of people down to the worse off. Right? That's going to achieve equality, eliminate inequality, right? But you're not benefiting. So you might think, well, the two views are going to come apart in those kinds of cases, but in fact, as Parfit points out, you could be a moderate egalitarian. So you could balance the two principles or attach weights to them in such a way that, according to your view, leveling down is never better, or at least never better, all things considered. It's not what we should do. So at least with respect to whether or not we should level down, the two views might agree about that as well. Okay, so what's the difference? Parfit has a nice analogy he uses to highlight what he takes to be one of the crucial, essential differences between these two views. So his analogy is the first one I've got here, the first case. So imagine you've got two people on a mountain, and one guy is at the summit, another guy is sort of halfway up, right? And the guy who's at the summit is going to have more difficulty breathing than the person who's halfway up. And we say, why is it hard for him to breathe than the other person? We say, well, that's because he's higher up. Right? Okay, so that's one case. Second case, so this is mine, it's supposed to try and bring out the contrast. can imagine people at a concert, right, trying to see the band, they're trying to see the critique of pure rhythm, let's say, and they're standing, right, and the shorter people in the audience, sadly, don't have as good a view of the band, right, because their view is obscured by the taller people, let's say. Right? And we ask, well, why is it that the shorter people are finding it harder to see the band? That's because they're shorter. Right? Okay. But, so here's the difference, right? In the first case, right, if you, so the person who's higher up is finding it more difficult to breathe because he's higher up than the person who's lower down, in one sense, but in another sense, not, right? Because if you were to take away the person who's lower down, the guy at the top of the mountain is still going to find it just as difficult to breathe. So the way we might put this is by saying the ease with which a person can breathe depends on their absolute altitude, not their altitude relative to other people. I guess it depends on more than that, but you get the idea. Whereas in the crowd case, at the concert, right, the shorter people finding it harder to see because they're shorter, right? But if you took the taller guys away, right, they would now find it easier to see. Right? So it's a kind of different kind of because in each case. Right? And the idea is in the second case, the ease with which you can see the band depends on not your sort of absolute height, but your height relative to others. That's supposed to be the contrast. Okay, so now the idea is, going back to prioritarianism and egalitarianism, so the question here is, as Parfit puts it, how much does it matter to benefit a person, or how urgent is it to benefit a person? So when we've got a choice between benefiting a worse off person or a better off person, both views say that it matters more, or it's more urgent to benefit the worse off person. And in a way, they might both say that's because he's worse off. But according to prioritarianism, this is like the altitude breathing case. So if there was no person better off, it would still matter just as much. It would be just as urgent to benefit the person who was worse off. So how much it matters to benefit a person depends on her absolute level of well-being, according to prioritarianism. Whereas according to egalitarianism, it's more like the case of seeing the band. Right? So how much it matters to benefit a person depends on her relative level of well-being. So if there's someone who's better off than her, it's going to matter more to benefit her. Benefiting the worse off person is going to matter more than if we take the better off person away. Whereas if there's no one better off. So according to egalitarianism, it's relative well-being that matters. Okay, so here's just an example to kind of try and illustrate the point. So the issue here is about how much it matters to benefit a person. How much benefiting a person matters. That's the way that Parfit puts it. Right? So the question we might ask about, well, what do we mean by that? And I think a natural way to interpret that is to say, well, how much it matters to a benefit person is how much good we will do by benefiting them, or how much the overall value of the outcomes will be increased as a result of benefiting them. Right? So if we want to know how much it matters to benefit a person, right, we think about a situation in which she's not benefited, compare that with an outcome in which she received the benefit, everything else is how constant, and look at the difference in value between those two outcomes. That's how much it matters to benefit her. That seems to be a natural way of interpreting this. So now if we look at these two choices here, so in the first case, right, so the numbers here represent well-being, right? We've got two individuals. So the first number is the well-being of the first, second is the second person, right? So in the first case, choice one, we could benefit the first person, right, if we chose the second of the two outcomes, and that person's well-being would increase by 1 unit, right, so it would be a sort of benefit of size 1. That's true in the second case as well, right, so in either case the second person's well-being is a constant, right, but the difference is in the first case, the second person is at a higher level, whereas in the second case, the second person is not at a higher level. Right? So if you think about it from the sort of prioritarian way of thinking, the idea is, in either case, what's going to happen is this person is going to receive a certain size benefit, right? And that's going to be the same in either case, right? And all that matters is this individual's absolute level of well-being, so that's the same in both cases. That the sort of relative levels of well-being doesn't matter, and so the difference in value should be the same in both cases. That's the prioritarian view. So if you think about it as a sort of egalitarian, it's a bit different, right? Because in the first case, the second outcome here is sort of better in both ways. It's got more total well-being, and it's more equal, right? So sort of both reasons or both principles are pointing in the same direction, right? Whereas in the second case, right, although the second outcome has the greater total well-being, it's also less equal, right? So there's sort of two principles that make up egalitarianism kind of pointing in different directions here. Now, according to the moderate egalitarian, the total well-being principle kind of wins out in this case. So this one is better, right? But because it's sort of pushing against the sort of principle of equality, the sort of net result is that this is not sort of as much better than this as this is better than this, right? So the difference in value between these two is going to be less. That's the idea on the egalitarian view. Okay. So that's the introduction. What I want to do in the rest of the talk is sort of take that idea, so the idea that according to prioritarianism, it's the absolute levels of well-being that matter. I'm going to call that view absolutism, which is probably a bad name, but anyway. So I'm going to propose a kind of precise definition of absolutism. That's the first goal. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about some implications of that. Right? So the idea is, if we think of absolutism as being a kind of essential property of a prioritarian view, right, what implications will prioritarianism then have? And it turns out they are problematic. Okay, so that's where we're going. So my definition of absolutism. I'm going to use a sort of fairly familiar and simple framework, I hope. So an outcome is just a sequence of non-negative real numbers. So these numbers represent levels of well-being for different individuals. I'm assuming that the numbers are non-negative because there's difficulties in kind of defining prioritarianism when you have negative utilities as well. So just to simplify things, let's just assume it's all positive or non-negative. I'm assuming that well-being can be interpersonally compared and measured on a ratio scale. So the unit is arbitrary, but we're assuming we've sort of fixed the 0 point somehow. And I'm going to talk about what I'll call value functions. So a value function is just a function that maps each outcome to a number, right, a real number, and a value function represents an ordering on the set of outcomes in a sort of familiar way. It assigns greater numbers to outcomes which occur higher in the order. So that's the sort of basic setup. Okay, so now let's look at some examples of value functions. It's going to be useful to have some sort of concrete examples to work with. So the first one obviously is just utilitarianism, right? So on the first one here, we just add up all the well-being levels, get the total well-being, right? That's utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is to maximize the total well-being. The second one is a kind of example of a what we might think of as a prioritarian value function. So it's kind of like utilitarianism, but instead of adding up the well-being levels, we first sort of apply what we might think of as a kind of weighting function. In this case, it's the square root function, just for the sake of having a kind of simple example. The important thing here is that it is a strictly concave function, right? So it goes like that. And of course, the effect of that is sort of just what we want. Benefits to people who are worse off are going to count for more than benefits to people who are better off, right? Because of the concavity of the function. Right? So that's a kind of sort of standard way of formally representing prioritarianism. And thirdly, we've got this monster. So this is you can think of as a kind of egalitarian value function. So on the term on the left here, that represents the that's the total well-being, right? What we have on the right here, we can think of as a kind of measure of inequality. So you can see, for example, in the case where everyone has the same well-being level, all these differences here will be 0, right? So this whole term will be 0, right? So we get 0 when there's no inequality, which is what we want. And generally speaking, when the gaps between people's levels of well-being get bigger, then these differences will be bigger, so we'll get a sort of larger number. Right? And so we're sort of subtracting the amount of inequality. That's the idea. So you might be wondering why this particular inequality measure, and because obviously there's lots of different ways of measuring inequality. Why did I choose this one? Well, there's a reason, and that is, as I show on my next slide, it turns out that the two value functions, the prioritarian one and that particular egalitarian one, or those particular value functions, right, are ordinally equivalent. So they represent exactly the same order. We can just sort of simplify the definition of the egalitarian value function, and it turns out to be that. And you can see that that is a strictly increasing transformation of what we've got inside here, and that's just the prioritarian value function. Right? So they order the outcomes in exactly the same way. Right? So what I've done here, it's a kind of trick which I think is fairly well known. Right? So there's a way that you can start with a prioritarian value function and use that to define an inequality measure. This is the Atkinson idea. Right? So Christian's familiar with this. So this here is, well, so what you do is take an outcome, you find another outcome which is equally good according to the prioritarian value function and is perfectly equal. Right? So if the first outcome is not perfectly equal, this new one is going to have a smaller total well-being. Right? And so then the degree of inequality in the original outcome is the difference in total well-being between the first one and this perfectly equal one that you found. And this here is the total well-being in the other outcome. So it's kind of a trick, I suppose. But I think it's true that it is plausible to regard, if I go back, I think it's quite plausible to regard this as a measure of inequality. So it satisfies other properties we would like the Pigou-Dalton Principle and other things as well. Okay, so what we might say is, with respect to the order of outcomes in terms of their value, there need not be any disagreement between prioritarianism and egalitarianism. You might think that is the lesson we might take from that. So if you go back to the example I gave before, you can see that they're not, as we might say, cardinally equivalent, right? So they don't represent the same cardinal information, you might say. Right? So the differences in the values of these value functions are going to be different. As we wanted before, right, difference in value for prioritarianism is the same in both cases, right? Whereas the difference here is only a half, whereas the difference here is 1.5, right? So that sort of fits the example I was discussing before. Okay, so what does this tell us? So the sort of salient or relevant difference between these two value functions in this context is sort of what is sort of illustrated by that example before, right? Is that what I'm calling the prioritarian value function is additively separable. So here's our definition of additive separability. Right? It's additively separable if it can be represented as the sum of some function of the well-being of each individual, to put it very roughly. So obviously, the prioritarian value function satisfies this, because we just put the square root function in there. And so additive separability, kind of an additively separable function, has the kinds of property we want to capture that absolutist idea in prioritarianism. Because it's additively separable, if you hold fixed everyone else's level of well-being, right, and just raise one person's, right, that's going to make a certain difference to the total value of that value function, right, the total value of the outcome according to that value function. Right. And that's going to be the same no matter where you fix everybody else's level of well-being. Right. So the idea is it's only the absolute level that matters. If the value function is not additively separable, it doesn't have that property. So that sort of captures the idea that it's the relative levels that matter. Okay, so the idea that sort of prioritarianism is connected with additive separability is not new. A lot of people have said that before.
So essentially there's two ideas there. So one is the idea that the value you attach to sort of move, say, your well-being up or down is completely independent of everybody else's.
Yeah.
And there's another thought that the value of a sort of unit move is independent of where you started from, which is the second thought.
Right.
They're not quite the same thing.
That's right. So the second thought is not a prioritarian thought.
But it's an absolutist thought.
Well, I don't know. I mean, not as I'm defining absolutism. I don't think that is because I mean that's not a prioritarian. It's not. I'm thinking of absolutism as sort of whatever is the feature of prioritarianism which distinguishes it from egalitarianism, as illustrated by the Parfit analogy and the idea that it's the absolute well-being that matters, right? So the second idea isn't going to be that, because that's inconsistent with prioritarianism. Right. That would be kind of utilitarian.
That's even more absolutist.
Even more absolutist, you might say, in a sense. Yeah. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Right. So now the point I want to make here is that the way that I've been distinguishing or trying to distinguish the two views is can't be done solely in terms of the order of the outcomes, the way that they, as you might say, ordinally represent the value of outcomes. Right? Because as we've seen, these two views are ordinally equivalent. Right? The difference has crucially to do with sort of cardinal comparisons between outcomes, the ratios of differences in values between outcomes. Right? So we have to define absolutism in terms of the latter idea. Right? So how do we do that? So what I'm going to say is, this is just a bit of terminology. So I'm going to say the value function ordinally represents the value of outcomes if it assigns greater numbers to better outcomes. Or it represents the at least as good as relation on outcomes. And I'm going to say that it cardinally represents the value of outcomes if, in addition, it represents the ratios of differences in values as well. That's what that says. So then absolutism, I claim, so this is the sort of core feature of prioritarianism which distinguishes it from egalitarianism, is this view. The value of outcomes is cardinally represented by an additively separable value function. That's my claim. I think in the past, what people have said, and in fact I have said, is that the sort of key feature of prioritarianism is that the value of outcomes is merely ordinally represented by an additively separable value function. And I don't think that's adequate to distinguish the two views, right? Because as we've seen, they can be orderly equivalent, right? So if you thought, let me leave it at that. Yes.
So this really presupposes an understanding of goodness that is cardinally measurable. So if you held the view that there is no notion of goodness that is unique up to, I don't know, at least positive affine or even ratio scale transformations, and if you thought that all we have is a betterness structure which is ordinal, then we wouldn't really meaningfully be able to distinguish between your absolutism and the merely ordinal absolutism.
That's right. That's right. And I think in that case, we couldn't make the distinction between, this is my suggestion, we couldn't make the distinction between prioritarianism and egalitarianism that Parfit wants to make. That's my claim anyway.
I have a later discussion after response to that, but
okay,
may not work.
I look forward to hearing it. Okay, so this is, this really is just now to get to the point that Christian just raised, right? So this view, which I've defined absolutism, presupposes that we can make sense of cardinal comparisons of the value of outcomes. We can meaningfully say that the difference in value between these outcomes is, say, twice the difference in value between these other outcomes. So, question, what does that mean? So one idea is you might just take that as kind of primitive, right? Which I think is an unattractive view to hold. Right? Why? One reason is that I think there's a kind of unfortunate tendency amongst philosophers to think of value as some kind of stuff which comes in quantities, like gold or water or something. Right? And talk about how much value there is in the world or in this outcome. I think in that case, right, the idea of comparing ratios of differences kind of makes sense, right, kind of intuitively. But I don't think that's a good way to think about value. I think that's kind of a mistake. Secondly, I think it's important that the difference between prioritarianism and egalitarianism has some kind of practical significance. Right? And I think if we just say that the difference rests on this primitive notion, then we don't get the sort of practical significance that we want. I'll say about that more after I explain my alternative. So there is a kind of very well-known way of producing or defining, let's say, cardinal comparisons. Right? So this is the von Neumann-Morgenstern idea. Right? So what I'm going to suggest is we can just adopt that as a kind of definition. This is, I think, what Broom does, for example, in Weighing Lives. He says our sort of ordinary concept of cardinal comparisons. He's talking about well-being in this case. It's just imprecise, and we need to give it some precise meaning. And this is as good a way to do it as any. I don't know, perhaps it's the only way. I would certainly be interested in hearing other proposals. So the idea is kind of familiar. So we introduced the notion of uncertainty or risk. So instead of just comparing outcomes, we look at lotteries as well. So a lottery is like a probability distribution over some outcomes. So a lottery gives you some outcome with some probability, some other outcome with some probability, and so on. Right? So in this case, we've got X is better than Y and Y is better than Z. We consider a lottery that gives you an equal chance of getting either X or Z, sort of top and bottom ones, right? Compare that with Y, right? And suppose we decide that getting Y for sure is equally as good as getting this lottery, then that's what it is for the difference in value between X and Y to be the same as the difference in value between Y and Z. So I don't mean this as a kind of substantive claim. It's supposed to be a kind of definition.
Why?
The last bullet.
Oh, sorry, this is wrong.
Why?
Should be Y. Sorry. Okay. So now we can sort of plug this into my definition of absolutism. Right? So this is just a kind of definition of a lottery. A lottery is a sequence of pairs, a probability plus an outcome. Right? Familiar idea. This just defines the sort of expected value of a value function on a lottery. Right? In this sort of standard way, you just multiply the value of that function on each outcome by the probability of the outcome. The expected value of that function. So we put all this together, and my claim is this is absolutism. This is the feature of prioritarianism which distinguishes it from egalitarianism. That's my claim. So there exists an additively separable value function v such that this value function represents the order of, represents the at least as good as relation on the set of lotteries. So I should say a little bit about why I think this is a good way to define absolutism. So it goes back to the point I was making earlier. So I like the idea that if we define absolutism in this way, right? So the idea is what we're going to say is to count as prioritarian, it's got to satisfy this condition. Right? This is the core feature of prioritarianism. Whereas egalitarian views will be ones that reject this. I should also say, of course, utilitarianism is going to satisfy this, which is what we want because that's the sort of feature of prioritarianism that it shares with utilitarianism. That seems right. Okay, so the nice thing about this is if that's the case, then there's going to be some significant practical implications or differences between these two views. Right? They're going to say different things about how to choose between lotteries, or how to choose in cases of uncertainty. Right? If we were just looking at outcomes, right, and the question is which of these outcomes we should choose, then there's a sense in which all we need is a ranking of outcomes. We just pick whichever one's the best, right? And sort of how great are the differences in value between these different outcomes? It's just sort of, you might think, in a way, practically insignificant in that case, right? You just pick the best one, right? So if the two views are giving you the same ordering of outcomes, well, who cares? You might think. I'm inclined to think that. Right, but now, what absolutism does to find this way is it connects prioritarianism with sort of view about how to order lotteries, right? And we'll get different orderings of lotteries in some cases between the two views. And so now there's going to be a real practical difference between the two views. They're going to make different recommendations about what you want to do in some circumstances. I think that's important, right? Because there's a kind of worry that if the two views don't have any kind of practical differences, then the sort of debate between them is kind of redundant or pointless. That's a kind of worry I think people sometimes have about prioritarianism and egalitarianism. So this is just the example we had before, right? But now we think about it in terms of the expected value, and we get the result that we want. Right? Okay, I won't say anything more about that. Let me move on to the implications of this. Implications of absolutism. Let me say one more thing before I get to Mike. So this is a kind of different way of thinking about things. I think sort of the way that things often proceed is like this. You sort of start off thinking of prioritarianism as a class of orderings of outcomes. This is the way that I've thought of it before. It's the class of orderings that can be represented by an additively separable function, which is strictly increasing, strictly concave, something like that. So now we've got our sort of prioritarian ordering of outcomes. Oh, but what should we say about uncertainty? Well, we need to sort of generalize our ordering of outcomes to an ordering of lotteries or prospects or something like that. And look, there's different ways we can generalize it. Right? There's going to be different orderings of lotteries which will agree with respect to the ordering of outcomes. Right? When we think of it as an outcome, as a kind of lottery. Right? So you can have ex post prioritarianism, you can have ex ante prioritarianism. You could have the view that maximizes the expectation of that, what I call the egalitarian value function. Right? This would count as a generalization in that sense as well. Right? So now the question is, well, which of these should we choose as prioritarians? Right? And this is a kind of open question now for a prioritarian. And my suggestion is that's sort of the wrong way to think about it. Right? Unless you think about what is really the key feature of prioritarianism, which makes it distinct from egalitarianism, this idea that Parfit was getting at with his altitude analogy. Once we understand that properly, I'm suggesting, that already commits the prioritarian to a certain view about the ordering of lotteries. Right? It's not just a kind of free choice how we're going to extend it. In a way, I think we should sort of be thinking about lotteries and uncertainty from the outset, rather than thinking, oh, we start with the outcomes, come up with a view for those, and then let's generalize it. How do we do that? I think the suggestion is that's not the way to go. So in fact, and so the kind of prioritarianism, the sort of true prioritarianism, according to me, is ex post prioritarianism. Right? I was discussing this with Richard before because I always get those definitions wrong for some reason. It's ex post. So ex ante prioritarianism just isn't prioritarianism, is my claim. Okay. So here's one potentially problematic implication of absolutism. So this is, I take it to be essentially an objection made against prioritarianism by Mike and Alex. I guess it's not exactly the example they use, but I hope this captures the essentials of it. Right? So I don't know if this is a particularly clear way of representing the example either. So apologies if it's not. So here we have 3 lotteries. Right. So the idea is there's only 2 individuals. And each lottery there's 2 outcomes, right, which are equally likely. That's the idea. Though in the case of B and C, it's not really a proper lottery, right, because you get the same outcome in either case. Right. Now, if we compare first A and B, you'll see that in this case, there's no, what do I want to say? In this case, there is intrapersonal conflict, sort of conflict within the person, right? In the sense that depending on what would be the outcome of this lottery, each individual will be better off with a different lottery, right? So if the outcome is going to be X, right, then the individuals will be better off with B. If the outcome is going to be Y, then they'll be better off with A, right? So there's a kind of intrapersonal conflict, right? Which of the lotteries is better for the individuals, for each individual, depends on what the outcome would be. But there's no interpersonal conflict, right? You can see, in fact, in this case, the two individuals get the same well-being in every eventuality, right? Their well-being is kind of perfectly aligned. So there's no interpersonal conflict between the individuals in this case. So we have intrapersonal conflict only. When we compare B and C, the case is different, right? So comparing B and C, there's not really any uncertainty involved, right? Because these aren't really sort of proper lotteries. They're really just outcomes. The same thing's going to happen whether it's X or Y. That's the idea. And so it's true for both individuals that which of the lotteries is better is just sort of independent of what the outcome would be, in a way. So we don't have the intrapersonal conflict, right? But there's interpersonal conflict, right? Because the lottery which is better for one individual, for the first one, is B, right? The lottery that's better for the second person is products, right? Oh.
C.
C. Thank you. So there's a kind of interpersonal conflict in this case, but no intrapersonal. Right? Now, I hope I'm getting this right.
Isn't it then wouldn't you need 0990?
No, I don't want that.
That's a certainty case.
Yeah, I want it to be a certainty case.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see it.
Yeah. That's good. So the idea is intuitively we should treat these two kinds of cases differently. Cases where there's intrapersonal conflict only and cases where there's interpersonal conflict only. So intuitively we want to say that A is better than B and B is better than C. A is better than B because it's better for both individuals. Right? So assuming here that the value of an outcome for an individual is given by her expected well-being, right? We're assuming that. So both individuals have higher expected well-being in A than B. So you might think that's the one we should go for. Right? In the case where we're comparing B and C, right? Well, there's no uncertainty here, right? Either we're going to get a nice equal outcome, or we're going to get an outcome with slightly more total well-being, but much more unequal. And intuitively, we want to say B is better than C. But it follows from absolutism as I've defined it, plus impartiality. So impartiality just says that permutations of outcomes are equally good, or in terms of an additively separable value function, that the weighting functions are the same for all individuals. And so if we add that to absolutism, it just follows straight away that A and C are equally good. Right? Basically, given those assumptions, if we just have the same four numbers, however we distribute them amongst these four columns, makes no difference. That's essentially what additive separability and impartiality will give you. So utilitarianism, I guess the first one right, it says A is better than B, but it gets the second one wrong. It says C is better than B. Prioritarianism gets the first one wrong and the second one right. So these are the two absolutist views, right? In this particular case, the egalitarian value function, right? So if we're going to maximize the expectation of the egalitarian value function, actually we get the result that we want intuitively, which is interesting. But that is a violation of absolutism. You can kind of see why, because in these cases here, right, all the outcomes in A and B are perfectly equal. Right? And if you think about that value function, when you have perfect equality, right, the inequality index gets value 0, and so the egalitarian value function just coincides with the utilitarian one. So it agrees with utilitarianism there, but it doesn't agree with utilitarianism in this other case, which seems good. Okay, so what should we say about this? I guess I'm kind of running out of time, aren't I? That's, well, I don't actually have much more to say, so.
You're not running out of time.
What's that?
Then you have plenty of time.
Yes, I guess that's true. I kind of wanted to be running out of time because I didn't have much more to say.
Yeah, you're good. You got 7 minutes.
Well, you might keep up with this.
All right, so I was thinking about, okay, so what might we do in response to this if we're prioritarians, right, but we're worried about this objection? How might we modify the view? Right? And so here's a kind of idea you might have. You might think that prioritarianism, we should think of that as a view about how to resolve interpersonal conflicts. Right? That's the point of looking at the weighted well-being instead of the straight well-being. Right? Because when we have a choice between benefiting different people, right, we want to give priority to benefiting those who are worse off. That's a core idea behind prioritarianism. If we think of it that way, it's about resolving conflicts, right? And we can't benefit everyone. But prioritarianism, like in the previous example, it's getting the wrong result in a case where there's no interpersonal conflict, right? Where it's purely intrapersonal. So you might think, well, what we should do is kind of maybe have a hybrid view, right? So in cases like the first, where it's purely intrapersonal, right, we go with utilitarianism. In cases like the second, where there's some interpersonal conflict, that's when we bring in prioritarianism to resolve those. So that'd be a kind of hybrid view. What does it mean to say that there's no interpersonal conflict between lotteries? Well, here's a definition. I'm not entirely happy with this. So the idea is if we have a case where we've got 2 lotteries, and in every possible outcome of each lottery, every individual in that outcome has the same well-being, right? So that would be the case in the previous example. That would be a case where there's no interpersonal conflict. I think that's kind of sufficient condition for saying that there's no interpersonal conflict. Right? Here I'm assuming that it's also necessary, which I think is probably too strong. But in any case, we can work with this definition. And so then the idea is, in cases, as I said before, in cases where there's no interpersonal conflict in this sense, right, we go with utilitarianism, otherwise we go with prioritarianism. That's how
Given that we use different pairwise comparison criteria here, can we be sure that this actually gives us a transitive social ordering? Okay.
No, as you'd expect, it doesn't.
Okay.
It's not surprising.
Yeah.
So let me say a little bit more. What's I going to say? So you can kind of see some rationale for this, right? So Mike, Alex connect their objection to prioritarianism with the idea of separability of people, persons. So, there's this famous objection to utilitarianism from Rawls that it doesn't take seriously the separateness of persons, right? It treats all the people as if they were just one big person, right? And we're just maximizing the total amount of well-being without any regard to which particular individuals are receiving that well-being. It sort of takes a principle of decision, which is good for individuals, and it just applies it to the whole of society as if it were just one big individual. That's a sort of Rawlsian objections, I think. But we're not just one big individual, we're separate individuals, right? So that's where utilitarianism goes wrong, you might say. Right. But if we look at these cases where there's no interpersonal conflict, right? So this is the case, as I've defined it here, these are cases where the individuals have the same well-being in every outcome, every possible outcome. So it's a case like, when we're comparing A and B here, right? There's a sense in which we've just kind of duplicated the first individual and the second, right? They're just kind of duplicates, right? And you might think, well, in a case like that, where they're just kind of duplicates, well, really the separateness of persons doesn't matter. Well, it's sort of in that case, in that particular case, it's fine just to treat it as if there's only one person. Right? That seems fine. Right? So the idea is, the sort of hybrid view, we use utilitarianism and that limited class of cases where the separateness of persons doesn't matter. Right? Where the separateness of persons does matter, then we go for prioritarianism. Right? That's a sort of thought. And as Christian pointed out, the hybrid view leads to intransitivity. So here's just an example using these prioritarian value functions, right? In fact, I think even the example I gave before would be sufficient. This one's a little better in a way. So the idea here is when we compare A and B, there is some interpersonal conflict, right? So we judge that according to prioritarianism over here, so B's better. When we compare B and C, there's interpersonal conflict, so we judge that again according to prioritarianism, so C is better, right? But when we compare A and C, there is no interpersonal conflict, right? So we judge that according to utilitarianism, this column here, and it turns out A is better than C, right? As you might expect, in cases where you use different rules to make pairwise comparisons in different cases, very often it's going to happen that you get sort of intransitivity. So I guess I don't really have much more to say about this. I guess I'm still not convinced that this is a sort of devastating objection. So I should say I am convinced that the better than relation is transitive kind of by definition. You sort of prove me if I'm happy with that. But I think there's sort of ways we can get around it. So for one thing, I don't think it's essential that we define prioritarianism in terms of the betterness of outcomes at all. We can sort of define it as a choice function. In that case, it's going to violate other conditions, which we might think are plausible, certain kind of consistency conditions, but I'm sort of not convinced that that is necessarily a bad thing. Right. Okay, let me just summarize what I've been trying to say. So one key claim I've been trying to argue for is that if we want to understand the difference between prioritarianism and egalitarianism, then we have to think about cardinal comparisons, not merely ordinal. That's the sort of first claim. Between the valid outcomes, I think that's how we can make sense of the Parfit idea. One way to understand cardinal comparisons is in terms of lotteries. But then when we put those two together, we get my proposed definition of absolutism, which is, I think, in a way good because it has practical implications, right? So it has some real substance to it. On the downside, though, you might think some of those implications are problematic. And so, if you want to be a prioritarian, I think my claim is you've got to deal with those. Okay, that's it.